This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the Golden Age, play the games they liked most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when Sega still made gaming machines. Actually, that's a little unfair, because despite slightly misunderstood stories in the gaming press, Sega do still, just about, make arcade games, semi-recently launching an esports focused Virtua Fighter on their, deep breath here, all.net PRAS Multi 3 hardware. A rather clever system that allows arcade owners to simply download games onto hardware they own and pay Sega a license fee per play, which the machine can keep track of itself. It also allows tricks like playing multiplayer against someone in a different arcade. I mean, obviously that's just online play, but it's an interesting concept for an arcade machine. Although it does occur, the last thing an arcade owner needs is you sitting there waiting for matchmaking when you could be shoveling coins in. And Sega do have to share that shoveling with the arcade owner, because the recent story actually dealt with them selling the last 15% they owned in their famous chain of arcade venues, which will now be rebranded after the already majority but now sole owner of the business. So yes, it does mean that those iconic Club Sega venues where you spent approximately 3/4 of your Yakuza playtime are now going to be a thing of the past. And it got us thinking. We're an old channel. We're old enough to have owned a Sega Master System, their first UK system, back when it was still getting commercial games releases. Last year it was. But also when it got games releases you could buy in betas. Also betas existed. And we were also there when their involvement in video game hardware ended, so long ago that there are going to be plenty of people watching this who are actual adults and never really knew Sega as anything other than a software publisher. For those of you in that category, you should know in the 80s and 90s Sega were as big a part of our childhood gaming as PlayStation or Microsoft are for those who are still young enough to have functional knees. Them leaving the console market in 2002 was as big an event for us as it would be for Xbox to pack it in at the end of this generation, and it is about time we paid tribute. Our magazine, appropriately, is what I believe to be the very last issue of a Sega-focused magazine in the UK. Dreamcast Magazine issue 34, and for a change it's not Future or even EMAP at the helm, but mostly forgotten publisher Paragon. The issue dates from April 2002, nearly a year after Sega stopped manufacturing the machine. This though is our real anniversary, because if you are watching this episode on release, it is the 29th of April 2022. This week marks the 20th anniversary of the last UK retail Dreamcast games releases, and thus the 20th anniversary of the last proper commercial viability of a Sega console. And given we've just passed the 40th anniversary of the ZX Spectrum, that now solidly means Sega's console history is located squarely in the first half of the mainstream life of video gaming in the UK. I'm not sure I needed that revelation. While there are various sources for actual release dates, there were 5 new EU releases in and around what I'm calling the last day of Dreamcast, Friday 26th of April 2002. 4 of those, Cannon Spike, Conflict Zone, Heavymetal Geomatrix, and Freestyle Scooter, are reviewed in this issue. And excellently, 3 of them are all within 1% as the worst game reviewed, so we can have a race. If we're doing this though, we're doing it properly. We're going to look at that 5th one as well, call it Artistic License. Which is going to mean we're breaking from Yesterzine tradition and not looking at the highest scorer in the issue. And there's a reason for that. Because Dreamcast Magazine is cheating. There are 13 reviews in this magazine, which seems very healthy for a dead format. A little too healthy. The gaming heaven would have been the very interesting looking Starlancer, but that game had been out for 2 years on PC and over a year on Dreamcast. In fact, Dreamcast Magazine had already reviewed it in issue 18. They cheekily do not mention this page count padding in the issue itself, although it's not the most subtle subterfuge you'll ever find, because the directory at the back still lists the original review dates, allowing us to find that they literally reprinted the review from 16 months earlier with absolutely no changes whatsoever. It looks like they can't have pulled the same trick with Soldier of Fortune, because it's apparently got 12% better in the last year or so. Although it turns out it can be like that, because they didn't proofread their own review directory. The first time I've seen that since the legendarily quarter-assed issues of the One Amiga and that Maverick publisher. And even then they didn't stoop low enough to reprint a review wholesale. The giveaway, if you're paying attention, is that the review describes the PC version as being released last year, when this is only true if you're writing that text, say, 14 months before this magazine was published. Again, this is literally a reprint of their original review, and that's true for every game where I could get hold of the previous issue to check. Naughty. But hey, what are you going to do, cancel your subscription? So technically, I guess we do have a gaming heaven, but don't get too excited. The best of these 4 reviewed games from the Dreamcast Last Chance Saloon is Freestyle Scooter with a stratospheric 62%. Okay, so we all do remember the 90s craze where Tony Hawk was basically God, and his eponymous and still seminal skating game was the gold standard of grindy flips. Especially by the second instalment when they'd managed to shake off a few of the kinks and add some proper manualling about the place. Dreamcast owners remember it too, because they got the first 2 Tony Hawk games. What I don't remember is a craze for freestyle scootering. But apparently, having talked to a renowned expert in the field, by which I mean my brother who has done some skateboarding, this is in fact an thing that actually normal humans do while being normal. Enough so that there was a game, sponsored in the US at least by Razer, who did, and apparently do, make scooters, and have been, and I quote, thrilling kids of all ages in the UK since 2003. Given this game was released in 2002, then I feel we have to assume that this is the catalyst for a scoot craze in the UK, especially as it got releases on the PlayStation 64 and Game Boy as well. But let's try not to hold that against it. Scootering though, I still don't quite believe it, especially when this is how Razer choose to illustrate just how cool you could look. Not only does the guy look like he's on a roller coaster for the first time, and they won't let him off until he solves Fermat's last theorem, they're not even on scooters, they're on bloody pogo sticks. Pogo sticks. That's what'll get the kids off Tony Hawk. Let me rephrase that. It's not any better when you press start. This character is called Chad. Chad. We're going with Amy, and we're going straight into the first of only 3 real levels in the game. The manual hints at secret ones, but those are all tiny bonus levels set in the same place rather than any real extra content. The first level is simply a skate park. That's not familiar at all, is it? The obvious Tony Hawk comparisons are something this game isn't even trying to avoid. The controls seem to work out, granted after I've had recourse to the manual. Said manual isn't exactly large. Of its 16 pages, 4 of them are music credits and 1 is the advert I showed you earlier. The game, despite having the whole Dreamcast controller at its disposal, uses 2 of those buttons for tricks, 1 for grinds and 1 for launches. Those controls are at least logical. You know how it handles in general if you've played another game, but it works well enough. Even idiot me manages to cobble together the points required to graduate from skate school with time to spare. Time I spend trying to hit the grind target, which is actually pretty high. And it's cumulative across all your grinding during a 2-minute level session, which makes grinding literally a grind. The camera is a little slow, but that's really the only control issue here. We can demonstrate some of the other problems with the game itself by going to level 2, the school. Oh wait, sorry, that's the wrong footage. That is level 2, the school in Tony Hawk Pro Skateboarder. This is level 2, the school in Urban Freestyle Scooter. You can't escape it. Everything in this is just Tony Hawk but a little bit worse. You could use the fact scooting itself tends to skew downwards in age to defend it, I guess. But I still think literally anyone considering this would be better off with either of the first 2 Tonys, both of which made Dreamcast. And if you had access to a PlayStation, Then that machine also had the third Tony game before this got released in the UK, and would even get the fourth. The levels are uninspired and a bit samey and featureless, especially when put against some of the imaginative vast expanses and even the first two of the other leading brand. The trick list is pretty minimal, probably because there simply isn't as much clever you can do with a scooter. It's all just... So why was it made at all? Well, everyone loves getting in on a craze, and Crave Entertainment are no exception. It makes sense to try and ape a popular franchise, especially as this is partially a recycling of their previous attempt, a skateboard game called Grind Session on the PS1. But there's something more interesting here. You see, while the Dreamcast got Tony Hawk 1, it nearly didn't. After Activision's mid-50s reviewed Blue Stinger was a bit of a sales bomb on the format, they were unwilling to try again. So another company stepped in to publish Tony on the DC, and you'll never guess who that was. Or rather, you'll guess immediately because it was Crave. The story is then predictable. Tony Hawk was good. Tony Hawk sold. Activision took the series back and published Tony 2 themselves, leaving Crave in the cold. I have no evidence that the entire existence of Freestyle Scooter is just an act of petty revenge, but I'm certainly thinking it pretty hard. The story is even more remarkable though. This game was developed for Crave by Shabba Games. In April 2002, as Freestyle Scooter was being released, they were bought by Hawk owners Activision. Remember I said the PS1 already had Tony Hawk 3 by this point? That's because Shabba had done the conversion. And they would go on to do the same for Hawk games on PSP, GameCube and PS2 over the next few years. So would you play it now? Only if you've exhausted every other option. And even then, it's so absolutely derivative of those that I'm not sure it even counts as a change. A bit of work, and I've now seen essentially everything in the game already. 62% is probably generous, because while it's not completely awful, there is just literally no reason this needs to or should exist. A quick content warning. The following game is war-themed, and unfortunately, for a game made in 2002 and set in 2010, it deals with events strikingly similar to those of April 2022 when this episode was produced. If this is not currently something you wish to talk about in your leisure time, then hit the chapter skip button to skip to the next game. Stick the kettle on for us when you get there. You have the time it takes Agamemnon to get sick of Imhotep's shit to decide. Okay, so Conflict Zone is a real-time strategy game in the mould of something like Command & Conquer. And stop me if you've heard this one before, because I'm immediately getting deja vu from Freestyle Scooter here in terms of being the bargain shop version of another, more popular game. So this time I pre-investigate the developer. Massa Group appear to have only ever worked on this one game, and being French, they don't sound like people who have many ex-employees of Command & Conquer creators Westwood who were very much American. And the other big difference is the Dreamcast didn't get Command & Conquer, any of them, or Total Annihilation, the other big RTS of the era. I played all of them. I've never played this, despite the fact it apparently did get a Windows release. That's not a wonderful sign. The premise is pure CNC. There's the Global Defense Initiative, who here are called the International Corps for Peace, in an even more overt attempt by the so-called developed world to pretend blowing up foreigners constitutes peacekeeping than normal. And the Brotherhood of Nod, who here are not overtly terrorists but are an alliance of the other countries. You know, the bad ones. You can probably guess the main gameplay difference between the two of these now, but we've got two whole campaigns to look at and more controls to learn than a stick-shift tractor, so we'd better dive in further. I spent the intro thinking this is basically Command & Conquer CGI without the personality, but in starting the game your first thought is, can I have that CGI back? Minus the recorded speech from whoever was in the office that day, this would be a poor show for a Mega Drive. In fact, Desert Strike on the Mega Drive at least manages to give you some proper animation to look at. You do see why I went as far as content warning at the start, don't you? Literally an invasion of Ukraine. Which at least gives me the chance to point out that despite what this game will have you believe during the entire run, Ukraine is correct. The Ukraine is no more correct than the Nigeria is. Okay, I've changed my mind again. Can I have the static text? It's weird that the game does so many style changes in its intro, and I almost wonder if something got artificially lengthened late on in dev. Wait, let's hear that again.
We're going over there not only to make war, but also to restore peace.
What? But his point is that the International Core for Peace has a side game where you will need to manage public opinion by rescuing at least some of the civilians in the general area. You will need to do this by avoiding giggling every time they insist on calling it ICP. I fail every time. Public opinion will actually affect which units you can build almost as much as money does at times, so you will need to watch your ICP PP. I promise you I'm not making these up. Yes, the PP generated by ICP is an important gameplay mechanic here. Also, I do have to say, the head of the supposed good guys having a literal shark in his office is sending me some fairly mixed messages. In the game, I immediately appreciate the always on-screen controller tutorial, because the instructions in the manual were labyrinthian. Essentially, there's 3 entire sets of button controls based on you holding the left trigger, right trigger, or nothing. The sheer weight of controls did mean it took me a while to find the sorely needed zoom, and the sensitivity on the sticks for panning is initially oversensitive, although again this is something you can adjust. Traditionally, for these kinds of games, this is basically a cannon fodder clone for the first mission. You simply get used to the controls by wandering around shooting dudes, and it goes fairly cleanly for me, minus a point where I thought the AI had got one of my guys stuck, when really he was merely dying of his injuries. Awkward. It's all a mechanism though to get to mission 2, where we should be able to start to get some S in our RTS. The briefing makes clear we need to build a base. The actual system to do so is simplified, probably sensibly. You have specific slots where you're allowed buildings, and you simply fit what you want around that. It's a system that would later be used in Halo Wars, and generally makes sense for a console RTS when the controls are not so easy. It's worth mentioning at this point that, despite its obvious utility, the game does not appear to support the Dreamcast mouse, so it's these controls or nothing. There is some awkwardness. The selection process isn't always obvious, and the game doesn't make it clear it's additive. Selecting one unit never deselects another unless you deselect the whole group. And while it's appreciated having the list of what's selected on screen at all times, between that and the ever-present picture of a joypad, that's a heck of a lot of screen real estate being used here. The other issue I'm having is that even with zooming, some things can be very small on screen, and I spent a slightly embarrassingly long period of time attempting to do a daring rescue of a sheep. I eventually solved the mission the way I like to solve all missions in these games, by building a bloody great arsenal, ideally to the level cap, and then basically reenacting the opening time of any given Primark sale. This is made easier by one genuine advance on the original CNC implementations. You can queue buildings and troops to be built rather than having to individually order these. This is so obvious it's one of the things they fixed in later CNC games and indeed in its own remaster. But here it's already present, so it's no trouble to use our income to spit out the best part of 70 troops and just stomp them. What we failed to do through most of this is do enough for the citizens, and our PP is below 50%, which could restrict us later. The solution to this is obvious. Try the other side. Ghost sounds cooler anyway, and they explicitly don't care about civilian deaths. You can tell these guys are evil because of that, and the black turtlenecks. Mostly the turtlenecks. The campaign is not the opposing viewpoint of the first one. It's a separate story, as the developing countries in Ghost try to take control of a good portion of world oil supply by taking control of the Nigeria and its surrounding areas, including Niger, which they are very, very careful in their pronunciation of. I don't notice, of course, because they are still saying ICP every 5 seconds. There is no way this wasn't deliberate. The first mission goes about the same as the ICP one. Disappointingly, the unit lineup appears to be near identical between both sides, and the biggest problem I have during mission 1 is that the game now uses red for the friendly units when you're playing as Ghost, which I rather expect to be enemies no matter whom I'm playing as. The second mission goes differently. I'm playing on easy here, but even on mission 2, my failure to initially anticipate I need anti-air defences means I get attacked with absolutely nothing I can do except scrabble to build them under fire and bring as many bazooka guys into play as possible. What distracts me a little is, thanks to the small graphics, I don't even realise I'm being attacked. Especially as, rather than construction is complete, this side says construction is terminated for a successful build, which is another small translation issue in the game. I try to use the re-education and enlistment departments to get some non-voluntary civilian support, but really only see 1 or 2 of them the whole mission. I'm guessing resource management is going to make these more important later, but here they don't really seem like they were worth the cash. It puts a cramp in my building a huge army plan, and in the end I spam some turrets up, bias myself to bazooka troops, and just pick my moment to Zerg rush the helipad, which is the main goal of the mission. Something which, in hindsight, should probably have tipped me off about the probable air threat now I think about it. Which gives me time to finalise some thoughts on this, because I quite like it. It helps the Dreamcast does not have a crowded real-time strategy market, but I might have to try and get a PC version, which presumably will support a mouse, and hopefully some slightly higher detail and resolution. It is Poundland Command & Conquer, of course it is, but even that makes it a game worth playing. There is a PS2 version as well, but that did considerably worse in reviews. Whether that's because the PS2 owners had played Command & Conquer, or the port is worse, I don't know, so maybe just try this Dreamcast one. It is better than 55% would suggest. And as we welcome the content warning crowd back and thank them for the cuppa, let's talk Sega arcade games. Or Capcom arcade games. This one is tricky. It's a Sega published arcade game by Capcom. For some reason, this Dreamcast conversion is straight published by Capcom, which is not a huge vote of confidence from Sega to say the least. There is also no way I'm getting out of this without a million copyright claims. This, like many of these games, is absolutely filled with licensed music. The title theme is from a Megadeth album, for instance. We'd probably better embrace it at this point. I apologise for the ads they probably stamped all over this video. So what we get once we combine heavy metal music with the endorsement of the heavy metal comic series is basically Capcom's own Power Stone, but with guns. Lots of guns. And on the face of it, I am absolutely down for this as a concept. It's a 3D arena fighter with projectiles. What it also has is a lot of customization options, for difficulty, for number of explosions, or even gaming it so fights are still tricky, but you have to win fewer of them. And so we take this to arcade mode without even beginning to look at the controls, because who reads those in an arcade? And actually we do quite well. There's a surprising amount of options the combination of a small arena and dropping power-ups gives you. It looks good too, with a hell of a lot going on. The capture files of this game are about 7 times larger per minute than Conflict Zone, and it's pretty obvious why. It's a mess of colour and explosions, much like your mum's room. Picking up the items is initially tricky. You have to be in a very specific place to do it, and that's not always trivial when someone is firing gigantic rockets at you. You also have to concentrate to avoid getting trapped in the corner, although of course this is something you can equally take advantage of yourself. It gets busier still. Periodically, rounds will demand you beat 2 opposing gang members, or in this case, your own gang members. This of course makes things really busy, and sometimes unfair. Generally the smartest move is to concentrate on murdering one of them anyway, just to stop attacks coming from 2 directions. Although, if you have a good gun and can bait them into standing near each other, you can expedite the situation. I can't quite work out if they're given less health to make up for this, but I don't think so. Making these rounds difficulty spikes if you can't bamboozle the AI into being an idiot. The stage variety is nice, although they're always no bigger than a standard fighting stage, and there's plenty of stuff to use as cover, and indeed blow up to stop it being cover if you're using the right weapons. And there's a lot of those too, from items that make your melee more melee to flamethrowers, machine guns, and even ballistic missile launchers. The jetpacks can also make a quick getaway much easier. There's also the Chaos Matrix mode for a little longevity, where you have to collect an item and get out while under fire, sometimes also having to kill the opponent. It's a nice add-on that combats how thin most arcade conversions are, but ultimately camera issues and the fact the game was never really designed to be a platformer kill it from being that much actual fun. I like this though. It's a daft slice of fighting game that does something to distance itself from, well, everything really, including Power Stone. It's over the top and mad, and I see why they made the music choices they did. I'm absolutely giving this a go if I see it in an arcade, and 2-player feels like it could be an incredibly argumentative experience, as all good 2-player games are. Dreamcast Magazine's valid criticisms are mostly that they're not fond of the environments, not unfair when compared to the likes of Soul Calibur I'd say, and they also highlight those camera angles and the removal of the Japanese version's online modes from ours. I think they're harsh though, especially now. You probably haven't played this. It was overshadowed by any number of fighters and shooters, and it didn't make it to any other home system. You should though, probably more than anything we're going to see today. They don't quite make them like this anymore, and I'm never going to be too hard on a game that elicits this much giggling, even if it's at its own absurdity. So before we get to the official gaming hell, if only by a whole 1% over the last 2 games, here's the nearest thing we're getting to a cover feature this month. Evil Twin did not get a wide release. Wikipedia suggests, without citation, it was exclusive to Game in the UK even. I can believe it. Your friend and mine Bloggo was working in Game at the time and remembers these games coming in, so it's possible they all were, or at least the 4 Big Ben distributed titles. Either way, I'm sure Game gave it exactly as much marketing as you would expect from a last day release for a year-dead machine. The price you'll pay for a Dreamcast copy these days, and the fact I had to search quite hard to get a ripped copy, testified to that. You very nearly saw me reviewing this off the back of the significantly less ruinous PS2 version. Dreamcast we have though. Although be aware my copy crashed several times in Redream, and part of this footage uses Flycast, which was a lot more stable. The plot is a thing. Essentially you play an orphan, who after being forced to celebrate his birthday despite it being the anniversary of the death of his parents, gets angry and tries to delete the reality of his imaginary friend who lives in his teddy bear. Horror movies have been built on less, and he's surprised when this works, leading to the disappearance of his teddy bear, and ultimately also himself. Finding himself in the wrecked imaginary reality, he instantly regrets everything and sets out to find his, still imaginary, friend. It's weird as all living heck. It's also very grey-green-brown, making it look more like a PS2 game it really is than most things on Dreamcast, although the DC is trying its best here. As we make our way through the initial sections, there's some lovely texture work, including the fabric making up these hills. Less lovely is the camera. You can control it with the triggers in the absence of a second analog stick on the cast, but it loves making things awkward for you, and at this point at least I'm not even sure what this game is. A platformer? More of an adventure game? Really a shooter? I hope it's not a shooter because attacking is awkward, snap firing the slingshot is difficult because of the 3D positioning, and aiming down sights not only takes some time, but is tricky to judge because your shots have a trajectory, and sometimes the hit points for environmental targets like the drawbridge and the cage this enemy is trapped in are surprisingly small. The game is generous with energy, and is also smart at using the collectible teddy bear figures as clues in which direction the plot lies. It's a pretty linear game all in all. The twist, and possibly the USP of the game, comes a little later in this world, where you rediscover your imaginative superhero ego Super Sip, who you can turn into for brief periods fueled by another collectible. He has powers that can help, several of which are really just powered up versions of what you can do anyway, but still suffer from the same awkward deployment issues as your regular abilities. For me at least, the hover jump activated by well-timed presses of jump and attack was something I was only pulling off about half the time. The thing is though, pressing on to roughly an hour played of the game, I'm still mostly just navigating up the kind of awkward platforms in brown-green environments that would come to plague the PS2 and 3 era of gaming. And you know what? This is the wrong time to talk too much about this game. There's promise here, especially if that PS2 version takes advantage of the twin sticks. But of course on PS2 the amount of competition is also exponentially higher. This though is a Dreamcast episode. Brown and green is not what a Dreamcast is for. A Dreamcast is for brilliant blue skies and sunny happy games. For all their faults, that's at least largely true of the other 4 games we're seeing today. And given this is essentially a Dreamcast memorial, let's not remember it for this kind of thing. Evil Twin is not good enough to overcome that disconnect. 55, 55, and 54 are slim margins sure. But nonetheless, Capcom's Cannon Spike, which you might know as Gunspike, is our lowest scorer of the last day of Dreamcast. Another one that's supposedly game only in the UK, the 2002 UK release came over a year after it made its way to the US and Japan. Which is strange, because this is a nailed-on Dreamcast conversion. By Psycho originally, it's a Capcom arcade machine, and like Geomatrix, it comes from the era where Capcom were using the Sega Naomi system for said coin-ops, which is essentially the Dreamcast architecture after a particularly good cup of coffee. So this is essentially going to be arcade perfect every time. You'd think it would be popular too, because this is a shooting game involving several of Capcom's beloved characters, including a surprise appearance from everyone's second favourite street fighting woman, Cammy, which I guess does fit with her background. The other observation I make immediately, and one that seems appropriate for what might have been the UK's last Dreamcast release, is this could not look more Dreamcast if it tried. And that is absolutely a compliment. After the grubby low-rent 3D of the PlayStation 1, which was restricted to PAL frame rates and video cables, the Dreamcast was a bloody revelation, especially if, like me, you were lucky enough to be set up with a computer monitor that took the classic D-sub, or, more colloquially, VGA plug. Then suddenly you had a crystal clear picture at roughly 4 times the resolution a PS1 usually put out, and you were running at 60 Hz. It would take another generation for the PS3 and Xbox 360 to finally make it universal with HDMI, but here is where the great regional divide of game speeds took a fatal wound. One thing added to this version is a big range of difficulty modes, which is very welcome, and how the game gates progress, because it's going to give you a fixed number of credits either way. Those credits allowing you to play a fantastic looking top-down arena shooter. If it reminds me of something immediately, it's actually Dead Nation from Returnal developers Housemarque. This though has noticeably smaller areas. It's a very claustrophobic game, and while each level has several waves ending with at least a couple of enemies fearsome enough to have a health bar, they are not long. Despite being an idiot, I'm playing on normal here, but 5 credits will get me nearly halfway through its 10 levels on my first go. Those levels though have a pleasing variety of locations. While we start on standard city streets, we very quickly find ourselves in what appears to be the grounds of the Resident Evil mansion, and later even on the side of a ski slope, on the way down it. We also meet another old friend as Street Fighter II boss Vega appears in zombie form to give us a hard time. Although in another indication of the level of effort being expended by Capcom at this point, he's named Bullrog. This is actually accurate to the original Japanese version of Street Fighter II, but you'd think you could have copy-pasted it somewhere during the release. The controls though are where this starts to fall down around our ears. The controls for these games in 2022 is so set that the genre is called twin-stick shooters, and we've seen recently that's not even a new invention. They originated with Robotron as far back as 1982, a game which is now exactly twice as old as this one for reference. But even if you didn't know the Dreamcast controller, and here it is, you'll have heard me mention the lack of a second stick several times this episode, and so we're having to try something from the old school. We have a lock button that attaches you to one enemy, but essentially you're going to be firing where you're walking, which is never ideal. The lock idea isn't implemented quite right either. It seems to expire for me after a few seconds, regardless of whether said enemy is actually dead, and then just changes to a locked firing direction without any particular visual cue, other than the fact the guy you are trying to dead is not getting deaded anymore. What you can do is resort to punching, and punching absolutely does more damage in this game than Cammy's gun does. The trouble with that, of course, is you have to walk up to the enemies in order to smack them one, and that does rather let them do the same. The game isn't really set up to give you many options to avoid this either. There's no dodge or roll, for instance. I'd suggest using the arcade machine to get a proper twin-stick setup, but astonishingly, it doesn't have one. In fact, where the DC splits the specials onto different buttons and lock onto a trigger to help you out, the arcade machine has the 3 buttons and your biggest special move has to be performed by holding down all 3 of them. A poor show, really. Which does make this the version you want to play if you want to play it. The reviews strangely don't mention the twin stick issue, probably because it's not solvable on DC, but do reveal how time has marched on. Because a lot of the reason it gets marked down is for being a perfect arcade conversion, and that's it. The review bemoans you can finish it in 12 minutes, specifically saying they had to play on easy to achieve this, giving you some clue as to why developers are loath to include that kind of accessibility. We spent the better part of 2 decades screaming out for arcade-perfect ports to console, and it took us less than a generation to start complaining about getting arcade-perfect ports to console. But while it does seem harsh to judge it on that basis, as a thing they were asking you to buy for 40 quid, I'm inclined to agree. At the prices it goes for now as a predictably low-selling title, it's not even a discussion. At the low price of trivial Dreamcast piracy though, it's a different matter. If you think you might get some joy out of this, then, especially as it controls better than the arcade and is the only home port, maybe do give this a punt. What have you got to lose other than 12 minutes of your life? On the back page, a lesson we've already learned with the Master System videos recently. We say these were the last 5 games, but they were just the last 5 games Sega cared to license in the UK. People have continued to make Dreamcast games for most of the last 20 years, including classics like the game you're watching, Xenocrisis. But our back page ad is specifically for this game, Intrepid Izzy, a new 2D Dreamcast platformer from Senile Team. The clean graphical style was always the DC's trademark at the time, and Senile have taken advantage of that to make this just genuinely lovely in all ways. And thanks to the DC being so comprehensively blown open that they can just write a CD, Intrepid Izzy can be had in a full physical release for £30, or $35 if you want a fancy one with a soundtrack CD. No Dreamcast anymore? Hop over to Steam, where a digital PC native version is £15 or so. Either way, support new developers for older consoles, because frequently they're some of the best things you can play on any given machine. Thanks to them, the Dreamcast still lives. The Master System still lives, and thus maybe after 20 years Sega's involvement in the console industry maybe just has a flicker of life left in it. And that's good for everyone. Next month is Omega, so you know what we're going to be doing, and you know you want in. If you don't, there's only one way to find out. Let me give you a subtle hint. And until then, remember, be an A Mega, not an A Mini. Good night, everybody.